Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
And welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new podcast that looks at the ways the U.S. is reshaping its future, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media.
So, Carlos, another week in Washington, another whole series of craziness that we did not anticipate. I have no idea what this looks like from the West Coast.
Well, in the words of my grandmother, may she rest in peace, oh my. It is, I think crazy looks like crazy almost wherever you are. It is hard to believe that we have just gotten used to it.
Yeah, and it's been so interesting to watch how members of both parties, as the president went through his second impeachment, only the first American president ever to be impeached twice in U.S. history, how they couldn't even really agree on what had happened on the assault on the Capitol. I mean, you had Democrats saying this was absolutely terrible, but a lot of Republicans kind of saying, let's move on and not really even talk about it, including the president himself. I mean, there wasn't even agreement on the facts, it seemed to me.
Well, what you and I can agree on is that this conversation won't end this week or next. And for better or for worse, there will be more upheaval ahead, political disagreement, competitive elections, and real challenge.
Yeah, and by the way, Donald Trump, although this is has been his last full week in office, is again defying history by saying that he will not even attend the inauguration of his successor, Joe Biden, next week. Let's see if he's even still in Washington by the time we get to the inauguration, which is another, I think, symbol of just how polarized things are in this country. Which makes this a very good week to be talking about unity. What does it even mean? Is it even valuable? How can Americans start talking to each other again across the divide? Is it up to politicians to take the lead from here in Washington, perhaps? Or should ordinary people around the country be taking the initiative and reaching out to each other?
You know, what we're witnessing is a polarization in our country, in our communities, among friends, even in families, which is probably as deep as it's ever been in recent times. Just have a listen to two of these viewpoints. Christine is a white, Trump-supporting Republican. But first up is Dwight, an African-American supporter of President-elect Biden, who says he's got some friends who voted for Donald Trump.
I've seen, from my background, I've interacted with white people who are from the South, who had not been around black people, and have a view of black people based on stereotypes, ideas passed down to them from generations or from the media, from movies, and that sort of thing. But rarely have they had personal encounters with black people. And so from my experience, I learned that when people get to see people as opposed to the idea of what they think someone is, and they get to interact and talk with people, most people get to realize that we're all just people. I have been urged by some of my friends to stop being friends with some of the Trump supporters, but I won't do that because it allows me to understand more about the other side. Otherwise, I would be completely have no clue about what they think on the other side.
So my name is Christine. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised. We can't even be in a bipartisan relationship because one person views the other with such disgust and distaste. For example, even in the dating world, I am currently with someone right now, but previously my relationship ended over politics. The fact that I was a Trump supporter, he couldn't tolerate it. It became such a problem that we ultimately broke up. I do have instances of certain friends that I'm unable to speak to, not on my account, but on their account, because they literally feel like no matter what I say, I'm going to be considered, a bigot. If someone calls me a racist or a bigot or whatever because I'm a Republican, I don't even know how to have a conversation with you. There's no dialogue.
So there is politics, toxic politics, even in the world of dating. A lot to think about there in the American context. But we want to look outside the United States because there are good examples in other countries of how warring parties, sworn enemies, have managed to bury their differences, how ordinary people on opposing sides have somehow figured out how to come together, either through a process of formal reconciliation or through more local initiatives.
Yeah, our first guest today is Maureen Hetherington. She's a community organizer who's been working on peace building in Northern Ireland for more than 25 years. Maureen, if you don't mind, as you get started, I'd love it if you'd remind our listeners, for those who don't remember, just how bad things got at the height of the conflict in Northern Ireland, where you basically had armed paramilitary organizations from the Catholic and Protestant communities fighting one another, and in fact fighting the British Army, which some saw as protectors, others saw as occupiers. Would you give us an example of how bad it was in those days?
Well, living in a deeply divided and segregated society with everything from socializing to sport and schooling being separate, it meant that communities were living apart and they were buying into particular narrow or mono-narrative that has created or did create and continues to create fear and mistrust of the other. That together with systems and structures mitigates for a toxic presence and fear. And the violence every single day, structural, cultural, physical, on all sides, plus a toxic media, fed into fear and mistrust that was very hard to break down and to build relationships.
So Maureen, when peace was signed in 1998, you formed your organisation towards understanding and healing. In kind of concrete terms, what were you trying to do?
Well, it was about rehumanising the perceived enemy. It was trying to acknowledge the complexity and the many, many stories and perspectives that were out there to bring people together to see each other as a human being and all our deep flaws and our personalities and our own perspectives of what has happened, to engage at the human level and to try to build trust and build up commonalities between each other, but also a curiosity to hear other perspectives that you would never otherwise hear.
Were there times where you didn't manage to bridge the divide, where it just simply was unreconcilable? And if so, why? What was distinctive about those occasions?
Our expectations were really, how do we create a space where people can come along and have their own experience acknowledged and validated? So the methodology we employed was about allowing people to speak for the length of time that they felt that they needed to speak about what had happened to them without any challenge. And then in the responses, it would have been other people asking for clarity, but never about judgment or challenging that narrative. So it wasn't about having a big expectation, but rather to allow people, maybe for the first time, being able to express what had happened to them and how it impacted on them and their community. Beyond that, we had hoped that in the rehumanizing of each other, we could start to build relationships based, beyond the labels and connect with people at the human level. That was successful. At the very, very least, we hoped that people would go away having felt that they had been listened to, and also hopefully in the hearing of other stories, they could start to change the story they were telling themselves. And that worked very well in our experience and in our evaluations of the project.
You know, Maureen, you actually go somewhere that I'm curious about, because you know that some people who are skeptical will say talking is great, but does that really yield meaningful change? How do you think about that now, looking back with your most thoughtful, most critical eye?
Do you know, when we set out to do this project, it was one of these things where people would have made a judgment and said, oh, that's about going and having a cup of tea and a sandwich and telling a little story. But it's probably the most difficult work that I have ever encountered. And I think that people who do make judgment on that type of work are people who have been too afraid to actually enter into the arena. I mean, I had talked to paramilitaries who said that, Maureen, I can't afford to speak to an ex-British soldier, for example, because I might have to down one. And that was meaning they might have to go back to battle or shoot somebody. They couldn't afford to rehumanise the other. So in our programmes, it was up to the individual to come. Those who were sceptical about it, I mean, it was up to them to come or not. But in the very numbers that we engaged with was proof enough that many people went away, and we got most of our recruitment through word of mouth. So it proved very popular.
But I was just wondering, talking is clearly very important. Did you find that there also had to be some sense of outcome? Did the conversations yield more when people felt they were getting something specific out of it?
I think that what happened for us is that after people had the experience through word of mouth, they spread out, what had been happening, how it impacted them, and people felt at the very least they had been heard and respected and acknowledged for what had happened to them. But also many in the community did further outreach, into communities that they would not otherwise reach. We saw relationships being built, we saw networks being created, we saw organisations starting to work together. So in that respect, we had quite a bit of a success, and it was put down to the initial work of coming to make that contact.
I'm interested in how much of what we hear from Maureen can serve as a model, perhaps even as a warning for people in America. Are there tools that Maureen has found from her work in Northern Ireland that could be used to open up conversations between people here in the United States? So Maureen, stay with us, because we're also going to speak to Francesca Polletta. She's a professor of sociology at University of California, Irvine. Welcome, Francesca. Thank you for joining the conversation. First of all, I want to get your reaction to what you hear from Maureen's experience in Northern Ireland and how that might be useful here in the United States.
Thanks, Katty. I think Maureen's experiences are fascinating. I think that conversation among people who have different experiences can be enormously powerful. I want to draw attention to Maureen's talking about the curiosity people had. They wanted to know what it was like to have different beliefs, to have different experiences. That can be enormously appealing, enormously satisfying. And there's a great deal of research that shows that if one does come to see an individual differently, then that can carry over into seeing the group of which that individual is a member differently. So there's a lot of research showing that this kind of intergroup contact can have the kind of ripple effects that Maureen talked about.
Say more about that, Francesca. What are some of the things that you think lead to strong positive outcomes? Because you heard with Christine and Dwight, and you've undoubtedly seen in the data that it can be hard to get people who feel differently together in a constructive and tangible way.
The kind of hope we often hear about, the kind of recipe for civic repair that we often hear in the United States, is that if people share their stories, they'll begin to develop empathy for different experiences. And that empathy will lead to a kind of liking, a kind of trust that will build broader solidarities. That, in fact, can happen, but the research shows that often it does not. We're quite capable of not listening to people's stories. If we hear stories that run against our ideological beliefs, we're quite capable of not empathizing with them. There's fascinating research showing that naturally empathetic people are even better able to sort of turn off their empathy when they hear a story that runs counter to their ideological beliefs. We also find that if people are asked to put themselves into the shoes of someone who seems to fit a stereotype, then they're even more likely to stereotype them. So there are many ways in which we can kind of turn off that natural empathy, that kind of natural curiosity, if it runs counter to our ideological beliefs. And so I think that's one of the challenges we face.
Can you give us an example of that, Francesca? That's so interesting.
Yeah, a terrific study by Huddy and Feldman had people read a story of a man who was in financial need. Unsurprisingly, the people who were individualists, who had kind of conservative up by your bootstraps views, who heard the story, were not likely to believe that the government should help people in need, were not likely to favor welfare policies. The surprising thing was that people who were individualists, who had those conservative up by your bootstraps beliefs, but who were naturally empathetic, were even less likely to support government welfare for the poor. And so the researchers theorized that we have the capacity to downregulate our natural emotional impulses. And in this case, when people read a poignant story about a man in need, those who were naturally empathetic kind of suppressed that empathy because it ran counter to their beliefs that the government should not help the poor.
Francesca, how much of that is racial? Because I can envision a number of African-American listeners here saying that this issue of people not wanting to believe certain stories, or in particular certain facts or truths, is more an instance here in the States of a dominant culture, or a culture in power that gets to pick and choose whether it wants to pay attention to history or not pay attention to history. Can you talk about the racial analysis of the work that you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many dimensions to it, and I'll just name two. One is that some intergroup contact initiatives, research on bringing groups together to talk about their experiences, hopefully to recognize their commonalities, finds a real problem when the groups are unequal in power and status. So a perfect example would be bringing together white Americans with Black Americans. And what the research finds is that the two groups want something different from their conversation. White participants in the group want to talk about how under the skin we're all the same. Black participants, or in other cases, groups participants without power and status, wanted to talk about their differences, wanted to talk about inequities. And so you can imagine that some people would leave one of these group discussions feeling as if it was wonderful and we'd all recognized how we were all the same. And the groups with less power and status might leave the group feeling tremendously frustrating, as if they had experienced in one more way the majority group's unwillingness to hear their experiences.
So the dominant group, perhaps in America, often white Americans want to talk about commonalities, and African Americans don't want their differences and their grievances and their historic grievances to be swept under the carpet. Does that mean then, Francesca, that the very notion of what it means to have some sense of unity or reaching across the divide, even that is different? There's a different understanding from people in this country of what unity might actually mean.
Benedict Anderson, a political scientist, famously described nations as imagined communities. And I think we need to think a lot more about what our imagined community is in the United States, to think more about the ties that bind, and to think about the different ways in which we might understand the ties that bind. So when we think about who we are as Americans, we can think about ourselves as people who are descendants of those who came over on the Mayflower. We can think of ourselves as people who reap the benefits of waves of immigration, who benefit from our diversity. We can think about people whose American identity rests in the fact that we participate politically. And I think what's important is that triggering, priming, drawing attention to one or the other of those ways of conceptualizing who we are has real impact on our willingness to imagine more inclusive or less inclusive policies.
Francesca, talk about leadership as well. I think over the years about people like Nelson Mandela and others who've navigated incredibly polarized, difficult, charged situations with different levels of power. Talk about the role of leadership and sometimes meaningfully moving a society.
hugely important. And my complaint with the idea that the best recipe for reconciling our political divisions is intimate conversation is not that there's something wrong with that. I think that that's a terrific idea. We should have the kinds of conversations that Maureen describes among Democrats and Republicans. But I'm reluctant to see the solution as coming exclusively from the bottom up. I think it can also come from the top down. So I would like to see Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell sitting down together, sharing experiences and reaching common ground across difference. I'd like to see Sean Hannity, a Fox commentator, or even Alex Jones, sitting down with a progressive commentator, sharing experiences and talking about what the norms of responsible political commentary should look like. So we know that people whom people respect are enormously influential. And so I think leaders can do that kind of modeling of reaching agreement across difference that will have an effect on the rest of us.
Maureen Hetherington, if you don't mind, I'd love to bring you back in and get your reaction to what Francesca has shared here.
Absolutely. I mean, so much of what Francesca is saying makes sense to me. We absolutely need ethical leadership from our politicians. Unfortunately, at the height of the Troubles, that was not forthcoming. There was a resistance of politicians simply because their voting base depended on division. And so there was nothing from the top down. So we had to create the conditions whereby we could do something from the bottom up. And that was about trying to reconnect at the human level and start to see people as something other than their labels and start to build a different narrative. You know, if you live in a particular area, you see someone as a perceived enemy and you're the victims. So it's always about, getting into perspective, the complexities of what had happened, but trying to relocate our historical context in a much bigger picture and trying to hear all perspectives. And we were trying to do something that started small. The interesting thing for us is that after we moved from actually doing these types of residentials and workshops, we ended up doing training of trainers so that people could go out and work in their individual communities to give more people their voices. It's like a ripple effect. And it was quite effective. But then Northern Ireland is a small place. And I would imagine that our job was less difficult than somewhere the likes of USA. It was more achievable from our perspective.
Francesca, as we wrap up and as we get to the end of a week in which there has been a huge amount of division here in America and also a sort of lot of talk about the value of unity and whether unity is actually what America can be striving for in this particular moment at all. I'm wondering whether, picking up on some of what you have been saying, whether a path forward is sort of a redefinition of what unity in the conversation actually is. And maybe it's not about some gauzy ideal of all, kumbaya and being friends and getting along. It's about simply being able to work together to be effective. And it doesn't really matter whether you end up liking people from the other side of the divide. What matters is whether you can work with them. Is that, and maybe that just sounds horribly sort of defeatist, but I'm actually wondering whether that might not be some kind of a path forward.
I think it is. There's been some talk about Joe Biden being the empathizer in chief. I'd like to think of him as being the pragmatist in chief. Right? That he is skilled in getting people to compromise, to work together. And I would like to see that as being sort of defined as part of what unites us, our willingness to engage in that kind of nitty-gritty of compromising. So I think the point, again, is that there are ways to think about what joins us in terms of our willingness to work together. Not necessarily because we really like each other, not necessarily because we're all the same, but because we do see common purpose and common benefit.
Francesca Polletta, Maureen Hetherington, thank you both for such a timely and thoughtful conversation. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Carlos, I don't know what you thought about that. I thought Francesca's last point there, and I hope it didn't sound too pessimistic about the idea of managing to reach across divides, but perhaps it's actually quite useful, and that the goal of being buddy-buddy with somebody who has very different views from yourself or different values from yourself, that's unrealistic. And actually, in a way, it's easier and more attainable if we just frame this in the context of being able to get along well enough to produce the results that society in general needs us to produce.
Yeah, I don't see that as a downer. I see that as a realistic and thoughtful part of the conversation because we know it's hard work. In fact, Katty, I go back to one of our very first conversations, maybe our first ever, when we had Justice Malala join us from South Africa. And you and I and many other people outside of South Africa have always had a great deal of admiration and respect for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but he was thoughtful in saying that it wasn't an unabridged success, that he thought there were things that had worked and things that hadn't worked. And so I'm all for having the conversations about what's really going to have positive impact.
Yeah, and I think it's such a timely discussion, of course. In the week that the president has been impeached, it's a very timely discussion because we have heard calls for unity that some people say are just disingenuous and that others say are unrealistic. And I think as America tries to tackle this question of, and we always talk about it in this slightly glib way, well, the country needs to unify and blah, blah, blah. We can't do anything. America is ungovernable because it's so disunited. And maybe actually reframing that is a useful way to think of how the country can move forward.
As we look at next week and we look at the states, sometimes I think what's interesting about any of these processes of change is that it's not just the obvious names, the obvious leaders that make a difference in guiding us to an outcome, but sometimes it's a surprise leader or a quiet leader or a different leader. And it was interesting hearing Francesca, when I asked her about leadership, she started actually to cite media figures almost faster than she pointed to political figures. Who are some of the folks, Katty, do you think over the next couple of years here in the States could be important to getting to a different place if you had to think that through, at the moment?
Well, we probably have to find more Maureen Hetheringtons, right, around the country. Yeah. Somebody who is doing that kind of work at a community level. But I can see, if you could probably pick out somebody like Rupert Murdoch in America and ask yourself, what could Rupert Murdoch do to defuse some of the tension that is in the country? And maybe it is somebody who has that outreach. Maybe it is the people who are on social media, influencers on social media on both sides of the aisle who have an enormous role to play, particularly with the next generation. I mean, I don't spend a huge amount of time on TikTok and I don't spend any time on Parler, but if I were to, I'm sure there are voices on social media who might be able to be having a role in this.
Yeah, I think that's really thoughtful.
I'll have to ask my 14-year-old daughter and see what she thinks. Maybe Poppy has some clue to this.
I bet you she does. I bet you, funny, we'll be talking about Charlie D'Amelio and other TikTokers, Jason Derulo, before we know it. So Poppy, we need you.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.